Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Streets of New Capenna spoilers, and it's day 2 of spoiler season, and we have some sweet cards to talk about, including maybe my favorite Ascendancy of all time. We got some mythics, we got some really sweet stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Capenna cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. Number 1, if you want to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you'll find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. Number 2, if you need some new Capenna cards, or really any cards, you can get them from our amazing sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish and even get a free MTGGoldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes, and they will hook you up. Anyway, let's talk Streets of New Capenna. First up today, we got another member of the Ascendancy cycle, and good God is this card crazy. Maestros Ascendancy, our Grixis Ascendancy. 3-mana enchantment that says, once during each of your turns, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from your graveyard by sacking a creature in addition to paying its other costs. If a spell would be cast this way and put into your graveyard, exile it instead. So Maestros Ascendancy, if you're willing to build around it a little bit and make sure you have sacrifice fodder, which in some decks can be an upside. Like some decks want to be sacrificing creatures, maybe you're actually benefiting from sacking stuff. But if you build around it a little bit and have sack fodder, this is essentially Kess the enchantment. And Kess never was legal in Standard. It's a commander precon card, but it is the literal most popular Grixis commander. It is a really, really strong effect to be able to reuse a spell every single turn. This is like a Snapcaster on an enchantment if you build around it, but you get to use that Snapcaster every single turn. So how do you build around this card? It's super easy. In Standard, we have cards like Sedgemoor Witch in Poppet Stitcher that whenever you cast a instant or sorcery spell, you get to make a token, and then you can sacrifice those tokens to pay for Maestros Ascendancy, and they immediately are going to be replaced because when you cast a spell from your graveyard, it's going to trigger your Sedgemoor Witch or your Poppet Stitcher. So really hyped to see if there's some sort of like Grixis token Spellslinger control deck with these cards in Standard. It seems like there would be a lot of potential to make this work, because if you're sacking those tokens, you're not really losing anything. You still get your Sedgemoor Witch, you still get your Poppet Stitcher, and the value you're going to gain from reusing all your removal spells, all your card draw spells, is going to hopefully push you very far ahead and allow you to win the game. Once you get back to older formats, you got even more options. There's Young Pyromancer. I could imagine Grixis Pyromancer. In Historic, maybe in Modern, you got Talrans, you got Monastery Mentors. So there's plenty of ways to pull this off. As far as Standard is concerned, outside of being a dedicated like Spellslinger deck, I'm also curious if this could work in this dedicated sacrifice deck. Like maybe this is an Aristocrats card where you're playing your Eye Twitches and Shambling Gas, and you got your lulls to generate a lot of tokens, and you're using Maestros Ascendancy to sacrifice stuff that you kind of want to die anyway, and like trigger your Meat Hook Massacre, recast your Deadly Dispute, a little jet, use Maestro's Charm to fill your graveyard and reuse it to kill stuff. It seems like that could work as well. Once you get back to Commander or Modern or whatever, even Historic with Red Horde Invasion, you also have enchantments that can just make a creature every turn. It's kind of like a 2-card combo. You play a Bitter Blossom, every turn you're going to make a token. You can use that token to sacrifice to Maestros Ascendancy to reuse a spell. In Commander, I think this is designed to work specifically within Hilo, one of the new Commander precon cards. It seems absolutely perfect for that. And Hilo wants you to sacrifice stuff and cast spells. Maestros lets you reuse those spells, also lets you sacrifice stuff. So an easy upgrade there. But considering how powerful and popular Kess is, I think we're going to see Maestros Ascendancy in a lot of decks. It doesn't seem that hard to make this work. Like, sure, you got to build around it, but when you think about popular Grixis commanders, you got like Marchesa. Marchesa lets you return creatures from the graveyard once they die, so they're kind of free to sacrifice. You got stuff like Anala. Anala, a pretty creature-heavy deck, but its ability to make useless copies of creatures that are going to die in your end step anyway, great way to fuel Maestros Ascendancy. Or maybe Cedrus with Unearth. You don't really mind getting rid of your Unearth creatures because they're going to go away on your end step either way, so you can sack them to Maestros Ascendancy after you attack with them to reuse a spell from your graveyard. Also just reusing whatever random cards. Like, you don't need to have some crazy combo for this. Just recasting your tutors in removal in card draw is definitely going to be enough. Like, that is powerful enough on its own, and then it works really well with buyback. If you read the wording on Maestros Ascendancy carefully, it says if the spell you cast from your graveyard would be put into the graveyard, exile it as well. What this means is you can cast a Forbid naturally from your hand, get it in your graveyard, then you can cast Forbid with buyback from your graveyard with Maestros Ascendancy, and it's going to go back into your hand rather than being exiled forever. So then you can cast it from your hand again and then do the same loop from the graveyard. So that's a really neat trick as well. It's worth mentioning Maestros Ascendancy does specifically say your turn. So counters like Forbid might be a little hit or miss. You can use them to protect your own stuff, but it's not going to work well to stop your opponent's stuff during their turns. But you got Capsize and Demonic Collusions. There's plenty of ways to make this work. So Maestros Ascendancy, I think this card's busted. I think this can make standard decks. I think this can show up in modern decks, in historic decks, maybe in pioneer decks. Definitely going to show up in a lot of commander decks. This is one of the stronger Ascendancies we've seen ever. Maybe number 2 behind Jeskai Ascendancy. But either way, Maestros Ascendancy is a really, really exciting, powerful card that's going to see play in a lot of places. We also got a super spicy red mythic in Arcane Bombardment. So Arcane Bombardment, 6-mana enchantment, says whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, exile an instant or sorcery card at random from your graveyard, then copy each card exiled with Arcane Bombardment, and you may cast any number of the copies without paying their mana cost. This card is ridiculous. So what this means, think about this, and obviously this is a commander focus card more than a standard focus card, although I'm going to try to jam it in standard just for fun. But think about how this plays in a game of commander. You get this down, it triggers on every turn, so as long as you have some instants you can cast during your opponent's turn, by the end of the first turn cycle, you can potentially have 4 instants and sorceries exiled with it, and then you cast a Brainstorm, some 1-mana spell, and you get to copy all of those for free, and you're just gonna keep doing this. This snowball of spells is going to be absolutely insane once this gets going. So this card seems just so much fun to play with. As far as comparisons, it's kind of like a weird twist on Eye of the Storm, except Eye of the Storm hits all your opponent's stuff and has spectacular art. Arcane Bombardment has got fine art, but it only impacts you, which is a big upside. The other weird comparison is it reminds me a little bit. It was like the red Spellslingery version of Deadbridge Chant. Deadbridge Chant, another 6-mana enchantment that does things at random with your graveyard, and that's one of the drawbacks of Arcane Bombardment. If this could choose the card that it was exiling each turn, it would be so busted, but because it's random, you gotta do a little bit of extra work or get a little lucky to actually make it good. So if you think about how this card works, I mean, you just want to be like looting an Emergent Ultimatum or some other ridiculously big spell into your graveyard, and then casting a spell each turn, trying to cast things at instant speed, because eventually you're just going to brute force exile what you want, and once you get your Emergent Ultimatum or Genesis Ultimatum or whatever ridiculously big thing exiled, you're just going to win the game. It's going to get really crazy really quick. So you want big things that you can cast, and also cheap things. Also, even if it's just all cheap things, it's still going to win you the game. Let's say the only spells you're playing are Ponders and Brainstorms and Ops and Considers, like 1-mana cantrips. The first one you cast, you're going to get 2. Then the next one you cast, you're going to get 3. Then the next one you cast, you're going to get 4. Like, pretty soon you're going to be casting a Ponder and drawing 5 cards or something. It's still going to snowball. So even without the big things, it's still just so incredibly powerful. In Standard, it reminds me a lot of Thousand Year Storm, is this like wonky enchantment that can do really big flashy against the odds things, but is probably, well, actually definitely not going to be a competitive card. I think it's just too slow to really be a competitive card. Maybe there's some sort of combo that I'm not thinking of, but I think that this is just a little bit too slow in Standard. You gotta wait till you exile stuff. You gotta have good stuff in your graveyard. You can get got by graveyard hate. There's a lot of ways that this can go wrong, with the biggest being you might just be dead by the time you cast it. It is really hard to take off a turn where you're spending 6 mana on a card that does absolutely nothing right away, even if that card is going to do crazy things in the future. So that's why it reminds me of Thousand Year Storm. You can certainly build a great against the odds deck with it, but as far as being like a competitive card that's going to win a Pro Tour or something, that's not really what Arcane Bombardment is. Although it does work really well with Magecraft, because Magecraft just cares about you casting a lot of spells. So if you can get down to a Stormkiln Artist or a Jadzi or a Commander Azathi or something, this is going to be even crazier because you're going to trigger your Magecraft stuff a bunch of times. As far as Commander is concerned, one thing I wanted to point out real quick, because I think some people be confused by this, Arcane Bombardment doesn't actually copy your spells or cast copies of spells. What it does is it's going to copy cards in your graveyard and then allow you to cast them. So that means Arcane Bombardment doesn't actually work with something like Calamax as much as you would like it to. You would think, oh, this is going to be a great combo, I'm going to be copying all these spells and Calamax is going to get huge, but that doesn't actually work that way because you're just making copies and then casting them rather than actually copying the spell. So a weird little technicality to keep in mind, but really, I think this is just an all-star in Spellslinger decks. If I'm playing a Spellslinger deck, I am slamming this in my Spellslinger deck, and it's going to do ridiculously wonky, crazy, fun, absurd things. Although I will say, This is another card that concerns me because of how it interacts with extra turn spells. So I think the most busted thing you do with this card is you play this and try to exile a Time Warp, or a Capture of Jinghao, or a Temporal Manipulation, whatever extra turn spell. A lot of the newer ones would work as well, like an Elrond's Epiphany, although you'd have to loot them in the graveyard because they resolve and then get exiled or shuffle back in like Nexus of Fate. So you'd have a way to loot them in your graveyard, but that wouldn't be that hard. But if you can get an extra turn locked under this, you probably just win the game. You just cast a spell, you're gonna get an extra turn, a bunch of other stuff. During the extra turn, you cast a spell, you're gonna just snowball and win. So I think that's like unfortunately, the strongest, most spiky way to play this. If you want to guarantee you always have a spell to cast, you can use buyback, like Capsize or Whisper of the Muse, is gonna make sure that every turn you have that one spell to cast to start the chain and exile something and cast all the stuff that you have exiled. And I think that I can even see a comparison to like Panoptic Mirror. Obviously, Panoptic Mirror banding commander is really, really strong because there's no randomness. Like, you put a Time Warp under it, and then you cast it, and then during your extra turn, you cast it. Arcane Bombardment at least makes you work for it a little bit, because you got to get your Time Warp in the graveyard, and then it has to be the card that you randomly exile. So either, as I mentioned, you just brute force it, and you cast enough spells that eventually you're going to hit what you want, or there are some ways you can kind of build around it. Like, Perpetual Timepiece says, pay 2, exile it, shuffle any number of target cards from your graveyard into your library. You could use this to shuffle in all your bad cards, or everything except your Time Warp even, and guarantee that you're going to get that combo piece underneath the bombardment and use it to win the game. Same with Loaming Shaman, or if you want to do slow-mo, just like Relic of Progenitus to slowly eat away the bad cards in your graveyard. But Arcane Bombardment, this card's just, it's huge, it's hilarious. These kind of cards usually aren't competitive standard, although they are super fun to build decks around in standard. But I think we're going to be seeing this one a lot in Commander Spellslinger. Next up, we got a really sweet Jund Mythic that I forgot about yesterday. For some reason, I thought this was a Commander spoiler until I upload the video. Then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is actually in the main set. So we're talking about Ziatora the Incinerator today, and this card's actually really sweet. So Ziatora, 6 mana, Jund, legendary Demon Dragon. It's a 6/6 with flying, and it says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sack another creature. When you do, Ziatora the Incinerator deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target, and you create 3 treasure tokens. So this is a pretty powerful effect. I mean, it is 6 mana, but it can offer a lot of ramp, a lot of damage, and a big body. The first thing I thought of when I saw it is, this is a pretty interesting fling/sacrifice commander. It reminds me a little bit of like Brian Stoutarm, the new Minsk Imbu Timeless Heroes. If you want to like steal your opponent's stuff and throw it at their face, or just play big things and throw it at your opponent's face, this is a cool way to get it done. Not only are you getting damage, but every time you use its ability, you're essentially getting a Black Lotus worth of treasure tokens. Like 3 mana, sure, it's split up between 3 treasures, but that's actually better than having to use it all at once. So as far as standard is concerned, I think this is designed to work with Blitz, with the idea being you can like Blitz in your Jaxus or whatever. So far, we only got 1 Blitz card, but you can Blitz in your Jaxus, and then on your end step, you're gonna have to sacrifice it anyway, but you can sacrifice it instead to Ziatora. You're still gonna get the card draw, plus you're gonna get damage, plus you're gonna get treasure tokens, so you can Blitz in what you draw the next turn, which seems like a neat synergy. We'll see if that's actually good enough to be competitive. We haven't seen many Blitz cards yet, so it's gonna depend on how many good Blitz cards we get, but that does seem like a neat synergy. We also got tons of sacrifice fodder. Like, one of the hallmarks of current standard is deck sacrificing Eye Twitch, sacrificing Shambling Ghast, and Ziatora maybe opens up a Jund sacrifice style deck. Sure, you're only getting 1 damage if you sack an Eye Twitch, but you're making so many treasures that it still might be worth it. Another interesting direction to go with this is big stuff sacrifice, maybe like a Jund Dragon deck. We have all the Kamigawa Dragon Spirits, which have really powerful death triggers, reanimation, more treasures, card draw, making big creatures. Ziatora is a way you can sacrifice them, get their death trigger, deal a bunch of damage, make a ton of treasure, so you'll be able to cast more dragons the next turn, plus you get Goldspan, which doubles up the treasure mana. Seems like it could do some really crazy thing. Obviously, a little overloaded on like 4 to 6 mana cards, but still seems like it could be a sweet deck. The deck I want to build most with this, though, is a deck that I've been wanting to make work since Strixhaven, which is the 10 the Pest sacrifice deck. When Strixhaven first released, we played this deck that was Daemogoth Titan, trying to sack it to 10 the Pest to make a ridiculous amount of Pest tokens, and then use those to win the game. You also got Daemogoth Woe Eater. Ziatora seems really well suited for that deck. It's a way you can just sack your Daemogoth Titan to deal 11 damage. 11 damage. That means 2 of those is going to kill the opponent. Plus, you're making treasures so you can cast more stuff the next turn. So that's the direction I'm going. That's going to be the first deck I build with this card. As far as Commander is concerned, This is probably bad Corvold, but I think that might be a good thing. Corvold is so busted and so scary that you're likely to be archenemy when you reveal it. Ziatora can do something similar if you want to build a sacrifice deck. It's not going to be as powerful, but it's also unlikely to draw the same amount of hate. So I like that there's another big Dragon Jun commander that works with sacrifice synergies, but isn't quite as strong as Corvold and quite as likely to get you immediately killed. And I think you can build around Ziatora in a few different ways. You can go Aristocrats, Blood Artists, maybe you throw some artifact synergies in, like if you're making a ton of treasures, and Disciple of the Vault is actually kind of another Blood Artist style effect. You could throw in Goblin Welder and like sack treasures to reanimate things, big artifacts that you sacrifice to Ziatora to deal damage. So Aristocrat's one option. You can also just go straight up Threaten Tribal, where you're trying to yoink your opponent's creatures and then sack them on your end step before you give them back to get the treasures and deal some damage. And then doubling or tripling up Ziatora's damage is kind of hilarious. Like if you get down Furnace of Wrath and Fiery Emancipation, you can easily get to the point where sacrificing a single thing can potentially just win you the game, or at least kill someone in a game of Commander. So I think Ziatora, the card's really sweet. We'll have to see. It's 6 mana. It does do something sort of right away, but it does require another creature to sacrifice to get that ability. So I think it's got a chance in Standard. I don't think it's going to be like super busted, but I do think you can build a really spicy, fun deck with it in Standard, and it certainly has Commander potential. It's kind of a slightly powered down, less likely to get you killed Corvold style commander. Next up, we got a little 3-drop Vampire Warrior in Maestros Diabolist, and this card's kind of interesting. So it's a 3-mana Grixis 1/4 Vampire Warrior. It has Death Touch and Haste, and says when it attacks, if you don't control a devil token, create a tapped and attacking 1/1 devil creature token with when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. So how good is Maestros Diabolist? And it is actually kind of tricky to figure out. If you compare it to other 3-drops that can make tokens, in some ways it's not that exciting. Like look at Brimaz, a 3-mana 4/3 that makes a token when it attacks or blocks, or like Kranko, a 3-mana 1/2 that grows when it attacks and makes tokens equal to its power. Even just Handwear Garrison makes 2 tokens. So as far as just its base stats and ability, it's a little bit meh, although Maestros Diabolist does have some really big upsides. One is it has haste. So unlike all these other cards, it is coming down and attacking right away and immediately giving you that token. And if you really think about it, you're getting a 1/4 with Death Touch and Haste, and then you're also getting a 1/1, so you're getting 2 power and 5 toughness out of your 3-drop right away. And then sure, maybe your opponent blocks the devil and it dies, but at least you get to ping something, and then you get to make a devil again the next turn. So from that perspective, it's not bad. The other big upside is just Death Touch. Like having Death Touch is really, really big. We see Standard decks playing Chijuru Biteblade in their sideboard just as like this weird Death Touchy removal spell, and a 1/4 with Death Touch actually shuts down a lot of early game creatures, and then later in the game, if your opponent plays something massive, it's going to trade up with it. So the Death Touch ability is really, really helpful, and it kind of turns this into a sneaky version of a removal spell. Also just makes it hard for your opponent to block. Like your opponent's not going to want to throw a big creature in front of this, so you're likely to be able to keep making those devil tokens, which is kind of a nice bonus, although again, you only get 1 devil token at a time, so keep in mind you might want to be sacrificing it for value or something. The good news is, that's kind of what Standard's about, and it's also what Maestros is about. So it seems pretty easy to have Deadly Disputes, a Little Chats, maybe Obnixiluses, and other ways to take advantage of this devil token. Like a 1/1's not super exciting, but when it's drawing you cards and making treasures or churning through your deck or giving you 2 planeswalkers instead of 1, then that 1/1 becomes really, really good. And this is a repeatable way, kind of Jadar style, to keep making those 1/1 tokens. The other weird upside of this card is the devil token's pinging ability. It might not seem like much, but when you consider Thalia, Prosperous Innkeeper, Elite Spellbinder, Tingleflower, Hedron, Spirited Companion are all really heavily played Standard cards, that devil can just snipe them, and worst case it can throw damage at your opponent's face. And we're entering into a Standard thanks to New Capenna that's going to have these shield counters, and shield counters are really, really powerful, but their drawback is when the creature is dealt damage, you got to remove it, so it's not quite as good as a totem armor, and those devils are going to be a really nice way to just break the shield, literally, of shield counters from cards like Falco and all the other Bant cards in the set. So Maestros Diabolist I think this card can be playable, but I think you got to be in a specific deck. I think you need to be able to sacrifice that devil for value, and then this is in the conversation. I really like the death touch on it, but overall, the combination of stats and only making one devil at a time does mean you really got to build around it a little bit to make it good. Otherwise, it's probably not quite good enough in just a generic deck. We also got a new Grixis legendary vampire rogue in Evelyn the Covetous. So Evelyn has one of the crazier mana costs I've ever seen. 2 generic mana, a hybrid Dimir mana, a hybrid Rakdos mana, and a mono black mana. So what this means is Evelyn could be anything from 2 generic and 3 black, to 2 generic, 2 black, and either red or blue, or the full-on hybrid like Grixis style mana. So there's a lot of different ways to cast this. As far as like standard is concerned, this mana cost is absolutely great and awesome. Commander, it does kind of limit the decks you can put it in, even though you could technically cast this as a mono black card. Because of what I think are unfortunate rules about color identity. You can't actually play this in a mono deck, even though that's the intention of this card. Rules committee, if you're watching this video for some reason, fix hybrid mana, please. So Evelyn, it's a pretty fun card. 5 mana, 2/5 with flash. When it or another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, you get to exile the top card of each player's library with a collection counter on it, and then once each turn, you can play a card from exile with a collection counter on it if it was exiled by an ability you controlled, and you can spend mana as though it's mana of any color to cast it. I think that weird wording is in case there's 2 Evelyns going, you can only cast the cards that your Evelyn actually exiled rather than what your opponent exiled. Gonna be a little weird for tracking, because if you each did have Evelyn going, the counters are gonna be the same, so you're gonna have to keep separate piles to see who exiled what or whatever. So Evelyn, it's basically a weird vampire theft card, a little bit like a tally, but of course you gotta spend the mana to cast a spell rather than getting it for free, although you can potentially trigger it a bunch of times each turn. If you have multiple vampires enter the battlefield, you're gonna exile multiple cards, so you're gonna build up a big stockpile really quickly. Also very, very similar to Tibalt Cosmic Imposters +2, which just lets you exile everyone's library, the top card, and then you can play those cards with mana of any color. So is Evelyn good? I don't know. I'm interested to see if we can build a vampire tribal deck in standard. We have some reasons to think it could work. I mean, we got all the support from Innistrad sets, Dominating Vampire Anj, Edgar Charmgroom is a lord, so there are pieces to make it work. And Evelyn, I mean, it can come down by itself. It's going to trigger and kind of draw you 2 cards. You can even flash it in on your opponent's end step and be able to immediately cast those cards during your next turn. So it is a nice source of card advantage. When you really think about it, it's kind of ETB, draw 2 cards in a really weird roundabout way, which is nice. Works with Panharmonicon, of course. Unfortunately, vampires have been pretty far away from competitive in standard. I'm not sure if this 5 mana 2/5 is what changes that, but I do love the amount of card advantage it can generate, and because of flash, you can potentially ambush something in combat. So even though the stats are super pushed, it's a pretty sneaky card where you can get your opponent once they attack with a small creature, flash this in, draw some cards, maybe kill it. So I think that's a possibility. Another possibility is just Theft Tribal in standard. Wizards has printed a ton of Theft cards lately. This is one of my pet decks. It's not a good deck, but I always have so much fun playing just a pile of cards that steal your opponent's cards. There's Xanathars and Siphon Insights and Curse Hospitalities and Uffiza Prisoners and Katosi. Add Evelyn into the mix. Even by itself, it's just fine. Obviously, if you can throw in a couple more vampires, it's going to be even better. But even just with its ETB, flash it in, draw a couple cards from people's libraries and cast them, that's not the end of the world. So I think that's another home. Another possibility could be Sorin decks in older formats. Sorin decks, like vampires with powerful ETBs, to sneak into play with its -3. Evelyn, probably not as good as Champion of Dusk as far as card advantage. Champion of Dusk just refills your hand right away. Evelyn, the downside is it's got to stay on the battlefield. You can cast it and steal some cards, play some more vampires, steal some more cards, but if your opponent kills the Evelyn, you're going to lose access to all those cards exiled with collection counters, because you need Evelyn's ability to be able to cast them. What Champion of Dusk just gives you the cards in hand, so it might be a little bit too risky. There's going to be a risk you just Evelyn and then it dies, and you don't really get any value out of it, but still something to keep in mind for vampire decks in like Pioneer and Historic or whatever. The place I really love Evelyn is Commander. It seems just like such a fun way to build a vampire deck, and if you look at vampires, Grixis is not their strong suit. There are two legendary vampires. One is Grazazol, which doesn't actually care about vampires. This is just a big Grixis vampire. And one is Jaliva, which is like a Spellslinger commander, not really a vampire tribal commander. So this is the first ever vampire tribal actually care about the creature type Grixis commander we've ever gotten, and it seems like a really fun one. Is it Edgar Markov strong? Definitely not. It's not a busted commander, but it is a really fun commander. You play it and you draw cards and you cast your opponent's spells, which is really, really neat. Plus, going into blue gives you some interesting options. There aren't a ton of blue vampires, but all of a sudden you can play Sedek if you want to, or Blood Tyrant, or Trotta, which wouldn't fit in most vampire decks. Plus, going into blue gives you other theft cards if you want to build around that ability. Mind controls and blatant thieveries and agent of treacheries. So Evelyn, the card's really fun. I'm excited to build it as a pretty fair but really spicy and fun commander, but I think it could have a shot in vampires in standard, maybe on the top end, like as a one of or something. Having the small stats does concern me, but if you keep this on the battlefield, it's going to draw you a lot of cards and maybe steal something good from your opponent's deck too. We also got, I think by accident, a couple of more of the commander deck exclusive commanders. It seems like Wizards accidentally posted these on their website rather than a week from now when they were supposed to be spoiled. But hey, we're not going to complain about new commander cards to talk about. So just so it's clear and no one's confused, not standard legal. These are the Commander Legacy Vintage, Commander Precon style cards. But we got Kros in Phabine. So Kros is a new Bant legend. 4 mana, 2/4 Cat Advisor. Says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a shield counter on target creature in opponent controls, and then whenever you put one or more counters on a creature you don't control, tap that creature and goad it, and it gains trample until your next turn. So Kros is kind of interesting. This is an ability that we have not seen much of. Cards that care about putting counters on your opponent's things. I think there's only one that I can actually think of in all of Magic, which is Generous Patron, which draws you a card when you put counters on creatures your opponents control. So Generous Patron works really well with Kros, but my concern with this is we just don't really have a lot of support for this. Maybe we'll slowly get there and eventually have enough cards to build a whole deck around putting counters on your opponent's things. But for now, Kros is kind of a weird standalone card, which I'm a little bit worried about how good this is. Like, putting a shield counter on your opponent's things, actually kind of a drawback. I know you're goading it, which is a bit of an upside, so it's not just going to be smashing you, but still, you're kind of protecting your opponent's creatures. So maybe this is like a weird group hug style commander. If you really think about it, there's not a ton of negative counters, especially in Bant, that you can put on your opponent's stuff. There's like Guafa Hazid, but the problem with Guafa Hazid is it makes the creatures not be able to attack and block, so it's not really working with the goad plan. I guess there's like Contagion Engine or Contagion Class for -1/-1 counters, but there aren't a ton of ways to put bad counters on your opponent's stuff, which might mean the way to build cost for the time being is just to put good counters on your opponent's things. Many +1/+1 counter cards don't specify creatures you control, like Inscription of Abundance, Quandrix Command, Thrive. They just say target creature, so you can use these cards to put +1/+1 counters on your opponent's things, kind of help your opponent build big Voltron-y threats. Maybe they want to attack you because you're being nice and growing their creatures, and hopefully they all kill each other with a goad attacks, and you just kind of sit back, you know, do the defense thing, and then hopefully sneak in and win the game at the end. So I think that's kind of the play pattern of Frost, kind of this weird group hug goad shenanigans style deck. So Kros, this is my wait and see commander. Right now, I think it's kind of a funny, almost group huggy political commander, but in the future, I think we could get more abilities that care about putting counters on your opponent's creatures, and then this could be a really interesting and really fun build around. We also got Phabine Boss's Confidant, a 6 mana Naya legendary cat advisor. Good set for cats. We've gotten a lot of cats so far. You get a 3/6 that says creature tokens you control have haste, and then parlay. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each player reveals the top card of their library for each land card revealed this way. You make a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token, and then creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn for each non-land card revealed this way. Then each player draws a card. So parlay is a mechanic we haven't really seen much before. There's a few cards, probably the most famous Selvala Explorer return, which is a pretty powerful card. It generates mana rather than tokens and life, I guess, but it works similarly to Phabine. So Phabine, if you think about how this is going to play, you play it, you go to combat on your turn. If you think about a typical commander deck, there's probably, what, 35, 40 lands? So odds are there's probably going to be like one land, maybe two lands revealed, and then probably 2 or 3 non-lands. So you're probably going to get 2 tokens, maybe, and then your team gets +2/+2. Let's assume somewhere in that range. Is that worth it for 6 mana? Maybe. I think compared to other Naya token commanders, Phabine's not super exciting. Like 6 mana is a lot. It does offer value, but the value is kind of random. I do like that it's drawing you a card, but it's also drawing your opponent a card, which is the drawback of Parlay. Like everyone's drawing a card. It's your card that's doing the work. Your opponents are getting 3 cards. You're getting 1 card. So we just have so many options from like Jetmir to Gyrid to Rith to Marith that I'm not sure this is like a top tier token commander, but it does seem like a fun card that you could certainly jam in the 99. The creature tokens have haste. I'm a little bit skeptical of. Like, it's fine, it's nice. It does let you attack with the tokens that you make on your beginning of combat phase, which is, that is good. Being able to get in some damage is nice, but I do wonder, like, there's so many cards that can give your whole team haste in these colors, like Fervor and Hammer of Perforos and Urabrosk and Rhythm of the Wild and Fires of Yamaya. Is it really worth it to just give your tokens haste when you can just be giving all of your creatures haste and then hitting with, you know, Phabine as well and all your other stuff as well? I kind of lean towards I would rather just give everything haste. So I don't think that ability is like a huge draw for me to play Phabine. The good news about Phabine though is if you're playing it, it's going to be in a token deck and you're probably going to have a lot of support like doubling seasons and anointed processions. And if you're doubling up the abilities, then it becomes much more exciting. If you're getting 4 tokens or 6 tokens every turn, then this is a pretty legit 6-drop in your token deck. So Phabine, I'm excited to play it in the 99, at least try it in the 99 of Naya token decks. I think it's borderline for me, whether or not it's actually going to make it in my Naya token commander decks. 6 mana is a little more than I want to pay. You're getting up to pretty close to the like Avenger of Zendikar range, where you can play cards that just like flood the board with tokens, do all this crazy stuff. Well, Phabine's a little slower. It needs to sit out over the course of a few turns to build up parlay value. Yeah, it's drawing you cards, but it's drawing your opponent more cards as well. So for me, this is, I'm going to try it in my Naya tokens commander decks and see how good it is. But I don't know if it'll actually make it there long term or not. Finally today, a couple of lower rarity cards worth talking about, with the first one being Maestros Theater, a new pseudo fetch land, which I assume is part of a cycle. So it is a land. It says when it enters the battlefield, sack it. When you do, search your library for a basic island, swamp, or mountain, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library, and you gain 1 life. So Maestros Theater, it's kind of a new take on a fetch land. The big difference is you have to sacrifice it right away. In reality, power level wise, I think this is just a worse Evolving Wilds. The land's still coming into play tapped. You can only get basics. If this could get non-basics, then I would think this would be a pretty playable card outside of limited or budget decks. But since it only gets basics, it's basically a worse Evolving Wild. A little bit of life gain is nice. It still could work in like a landfall deck where you're getting 2 lands to trigger your Scoot Swarm or whatever. But the thing I want to mention about this card is even though it doesn't look that powerful, I think it's actually a pretty neat design for Magic Arena. One of the issues on Magic Arena is the game normally auto passes. However, if you have an ability you can activate, the game's not going to auto pass. It's going to make you click OK every phase. And you definitely run into some people who have an Evolving Wild sitting on their battlefield, and it takes them like 20 seconds to do every action because they're forgetting that, you know, it's not just going to auto pass. Having Evolving Wilds formatted like Maestros Theater makes it a little bit less powerful because the timing, you know, is restricted, but it is going to play much smoother on Magic Arena. So I think it's a neat design to make digital a little bit easier to play. But power level wise, we have so many good options for these lands, even in like formats that only care about budget decks or Pauper or whatever. We have so many good common lands now that I think it's a pretty fringe card power level wise. We also got Illicit Disposal, a new casualty tutor. So 5 mana, search your library for a card, put it in your hand, is sorcery speed with casualty of 3. So if you sack a creature with power 3 or greater, you get to tutor twice. I think that Illicit Disposal probably has a shot in Commander. Like, people play Diabolic Tutor. This is +1 mana, but you might get to tutor twice with it. I think in a generic deck, Diabolic Tutor is probably just better. But if you're playing a sacrifice themed deck, double tutor for sacking a creature, which is something you want to do anyway, seems like a pretty reasonable deal for 5 mana. So obviously, we're not talking demonic tutor power level or whatever, but I do think that this is potentially in your budget / Diabolic Tutor slot, especially if you're a sack deck. Otherwise, we got Dig Up the Body, which is just a limited only card. And that brings us to the end of our daily Streets of New Capenna spoilers for today. So what do you think about these new cards? Are you excited about the new Commander stuff? What about the new Ascendancy? How busted is Maestros Ascendancy? All the other stuff, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoy it. And I'll be back tomorrow with more daily new Capenna spoilers. So until then, have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.